We need to delete this.
Maz, can we delete all VODs? And then as soon as the stream ends, delete the stream too? Can we delete anything?
There's something unsettling about abandoned things. A car left on a quiet street, windows fogged, no movement, no sound, until someone smells it. And when they open it, everything changes. This is the story of David and 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. A case that went from silence to something far darker than anyone expected. Before anyone found her, Celeste Rivas Hernandez was just another missing person. She had been reported missing back in 2024, and at first, like a lot of cases, there wasn't much information out there publicly. No clear timeline, no confirmed sightings, just a family waiting and hoping something would come through. Days passed, then weeks, then months. And that's usually when things get harder, because the longer someone is missing, the fewer leads there are, and the quieter the case can become. But then, almost a year later, something changed. In September 2025, there was a car in Los Angeles that had been sitting for a while. A Tesla. People had noticed it hadn't moved. At some point, it was towed. Nothing unusual about that. Just a vehicle being cleared out, like any other. But once it got to the tow yard, something wasn't right. Workers inspecting the car made a discovery inside, and very quickly, they realized this wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. They found human remains. At that point, everything shifted. Police were called in, the area was secured, and what started as a routine tow turned into a full investigation. Not long after, those remains were identified as Celeste. For her family, that was the moment everything changed. After months of not knowing where she was, they finally had an answer. But it came with a whole new set of questions. How did she end up there? How long had she been inside the vehicle? And who was responsible? For investigators, the car became the center of the case. It was the first solid piece of evidence, something they could actually work from. But because of how much time had passed, figuring out exactly what happened wouldn't be simple. Still, this discovery, this one moment, is what moved the case forward, and it's what eventually led investigators to start looking much more closely at the person connected to that car. The Tesla was registered to David, and just like that, this case became something much bigger. The car itself became a key piece of evidence. Investigators would have examined everything: fingerprints, DNA, digital logs, even the vehicle's internal data systems. Modern cars, especially Teslas, can store a lot of information. Movement history, access logs, timestamps, all of that becomes part of the timeline. And then there's the question people immediately started asking: how did Celeste and David even know each other? According to investigators, the two were not strangers. They had dated and been in contact prior to her disappearance, including communication online on messaging platforms like Discord, with screenshots going around online of interactions between the two of them. But the full extent of those interactions hasn't been publicly detailed or confirmed in court. What is known is their ages. Celeste was 14 years old at the time of her death and only 11 at the time David met her. David was an adult, and that alone raises serious concerns for investigators, because in cases like this, establishing the nature of that relationship becomes critical. There have also been pictures circulating online of matching tattoos between Celeste and David, so investigators are left building a timeline. When did they first make contact? How often did they communicate? When was the last confirmed interaction? And most importantly, how does all of that connect to the moment Celeste disappeared and where she was eventually found? Because once the car was tied to David, it became about connection, access, opportunity, and whether those pieces line up in a way that tells a clear story or leaves just enough uncertainty for everything to be questioned. Investigators had to confront the reality of what they were dealing with, because this wasn't a recent death. By the time Celeste was found, she had been missing for months, and that changes everything. The condition of the remains reflected that passage of time. Authorities later confirmed that the body was in an advanced state of decomposition, which, from an investigative standpoint, makes things significantly more difficult. Cause of death becomes harder to determine immediately. Precise timelines become less clear. Certain types of evidence can be lost altogether. Investigators would rely heavily on forensic analysis, autopsy findings, trace evidence, anything that could still be recovered. But the delay meant that this case was never going to be straightforward. For the people who actually made the discovery, it wasn't something they were prepared for. Workers at the tow facility reportedly noticed something was off early on, an odor coming from the vehicle. At first, it wasn't obvious what they were dealing with, but once the car was opened and inspected more closely, it became clear very quickly that this was not a routine situation. Cases like this affect more than just investigators. The people who find something like that, they don't forget it. And in many situations, they're the first link in uncovering what happened. Once authorities confirmed the identity as Celeste, the case moved back into public attention, but not all at once. Online, there had already been discussion about her disappearance months earlier. Posts, speculation, people trying to piece together what little information was available. But like many missing persons cases that don't have immediate updates, it didn't stay in the spotlight until the discovery. When news broke that she had been found and where she had been found, that's when things escalated. People started connecting dots, looking into who owned the car, looking into who Celeste may have known. But even then, an arrest didn't happen right away. And that's something that stands out in this case, because from the outside, it can seem immediate. A body is found, a car is identified, a person is connected. So why the delay? The answer is usually evidence. Cases like this take time to build. Investigators don't just need suspicion, they need something that holds up in court. That means forensic results, digital records, search warrants, interviews, all of it has to line up. And when a case involves a long gap between disappearance and discovery, that process becomes even more complex. Because investigators are essentially working backwards, reconstructing months of unknowns. During that time, online discussion continued to grow. Some people believed the connection was already clear. Others pointed out that nothing had been proven yet, and that divide between what people think happened and what can actually be established only got wider. Behind the scenes, though, the investigation was moving forward until eventually authorities believed they had enough to move from investigation to arrest. On April 16, 2026, David was arrested by the LAPD at a house on Marmont Avenue on suspicion of the murder of Rivas. Details around the arrest itself were limited publicly at first. What was confirmed is that charges followed shortly after, serious charges, including murder, and additional allegations tied to the circumstances surrounding Celeste's death. At this stage, everything becomes formal. Statements stop being speculation. They become filings, accusations written into legal language and presented in court. When David appeared in court for the first time, the tone was very different from anything in the public narrative before it. He appeared before a judge with legal counsel present. He entered a plea of not guilty, and with that, the defense made its position clear. They dispute the allegations, they challenge the interpretation of the evidence, and they argue that the prosecution still has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That phrase matters, because in a case like this, doubt is not just a feeling, it is a legal standard. From this point forward, the case is no longer about discovery, it is about interpretation. What does the evidence actually show? What can be confirmed? What is circumstantial? And what is missing entirely? Because even in cases where public opinion feels strong, courtrooms operate differently. They are built on what can be demonstrated, not what is assumed. The charges brought forward by prosecutors are severe. They reflect the state's position that this is not an accidental death case. It is being treated as a deliberate act. And that carries weight because in the U.S. legal system, the severity of charges determines what consequences are even possible. In cases involving aggravating factors, such as age of the victim, alleged intent, or circumstances of the death, prosecutors can pursue the highest level of penalties allowed by law, including life imprisonment, or, in certain jurisdictions and conditions, capital punishment. Outside the courtroom, the internet filled in the gaps. As soon as the arrest became public, discussion intensified rapidly. People revisited old posts, re-examined timelines, replayed interviews, lyrics, and online traces. Some tried to map out connections between Celeste and David. Others pushed back against speculation. And that's something that often happens in high-profile cases. Even after the arrest, there is still no conclusion, no verdict, no conviction, no final judicial determination of what happened. Only accusations on one side and a presumption of innocence on the other. And that leaves the case suspended in an uncomfortable place because the most important answers are still inside the courtroom process that hasn't fully played out yet. In court, a story is only as strong as what you can prove. And in this case, prosecutors and defense attorneys are building two very different versions of the same timeline. The prosecution's position is straightforward in structure, even if the details are complex. They argue that Celeste Rivas Hernandez did not simply disappear on her own. They believe her death was the result of a criminal act, and they are attempting to connect three key elements: her disappearance timeline, the discovery of her remains, and the vehicle tied to the case. Difficult is central to that narrative because of the vehicle connection and alleged prior association. But prosecutors don't just rely on one piece of evidence. They build layers. Digital records, forensic analysis, and any recovered communications all become part of that structure. The goal is to establish opportunity, access, and involvement, and then show that those elements point in a single direction. The defense position is very different. They are not required to prove innocence. They only need to challenge certainty, and that usually happens in three ways. First, timeline disputes. Second, alternative explanations. Third, evidence gaps. They question what can actually be confirmed versus what is being inferred. For example, who had access to the vehicle at specific times? When was the last verified point of contact? How complete is the digital record? These are the types of questions that can shift a case from seems clear to legally uncertain. Digital evidence and online traces. One of the more discussed aspects of this case publicly is the role of digital communication. In modern investigations, phones and online platforms often become as important as physical evidence. Messages, timestamps, location data, they can all help reconstruct relationships and movements. In this case, there has been public discussion about prior contact between Celeste and David, including online communication. However, the exact contents and full scope of those communications have not been publicly released in detail. That matters because without full context, online fragments can be interpreted in multiple ways. At this stage, one of the most important realities of the case is this: none of the core questions have been legally resolved. Not what exactly happened in the final days of Celeste's life. Not who had full control over the situation at every moment. Not how the events unfolded step by step. What exists instead is a framework of competing interpretations. The prosecution builds toward one conclusion. The defense challenges whether that conclusion is supported beyond reasonable doubt. And until a trial resolves those conflicts, both versions remain legally active. Outside the courtroom, the narrative is very different. Online discussions tend to move faster than legal processes. People fill in gaps with theories, assumptions, and interpretations of partial information. Some believe the case already makes sense. Others argue that too much is still unknown. And both reactions highlight something important: the difference between a public story and a legal one, because public opinion forms quickly, but court conclusions take time. Right now, the case exists in a holding phase. Evidence has been collected. Charges have been filed. Legal teams are preparing for deeper proceedings, but no trial verdict has been reached. No final judicial determination has been made, which means everything so far is still subject to change. At this point in the case, there are only two possible legal outcomes, not in terms of public opinion, but in terms of how the justice system resolves it, a guilty verdict or a not guilty verdict. And each one leads to a completely different reality if a guilty verdict happens. If prosecutors are able to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt and a jury returns a guilty verdict, then the case moves into sentencing. This is where the consequences are formally decided, and those consequences depend heavily on what the court determines about intent, circumstances, and severity. In cases involving the death of a minor, prosecutors may pursue the most serious charges available under the law. In some jurisdictions, that can include life imprisonment without parole. And in the most severe classifications, where aggravating factors are proven, capital punishment can be considered. But it's important to understand what that actually means. The death penalty is not automatic. It is not common in most modern cases, and it is only applied under very specific legal conditions that vary depending on jurisdiction and how the case is ultimately proven in court. To reach that point, prosecutors have a high burden of proof. They must convince a jury that the defendant had access or opportunity, there is reliable evidence linking them to the crime, and that the evidence taken together excludes reasonable doubt. In practice, this often means building a narrative through layers, digital evidence, forensic findings, timeline reconstruction, witness testimony. Each piece is meant to reinforce the others, not individually, but collectively, because juries don't just evaluate facts. They evaluate whether those facts form a believable sequence of events. The defense strategy, on the other hand, is not about proving innocence in a literal sense. It is about breaking certainty, and that usually happens in very specific ways. They challenge the reliability of digital evidence. They question timelines. They highlight missing or inconclusive forensic results, and they propose alternative explanations for how events could have occurred. If even one major part of the prosecution's story becomes uncertain, the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt may not be met, and that can change the entire outcome of a trial. If a jury finds him not guilty, the legal system treats that as a full acquittal. It does not mean the court has declared innocence in a moral sense. It means the prosecution did not meet the required legal standard of proof. In that scenario, he would be released from custody in relation to those charges. The case would be closed in criminal court, and double jeopardy protections would generally prevent the same charges from being retried. However, public perception does not always follow legal outcomes. High-profile cases often continue to exist in public discussion long after legal resolution. One of the most discussed aspects of this case online has been whether capital punishment is even realistic here. The answer is complicated. The death penalty exists in parts of the United States legal system, but it is applied rarely and under strict conditions. Even in eligible cases, it typically involves extensive appeals, long delays, separate sentencing phases after conviction, and additional jury findings regarding aggravating circumstances. So while it may be legally available in certain types of homicide cases, it is never a guaranteed outcome. And in many modern cases, it is not pursued at all. Right now, this case sits in a critical but unfinished stage. The investigation phase has already produced its core findings. The legal system is now focused on preparation for trial, but nothing has been finalized. No verdict, no sentencing, no judicial conclusion, which means everything still depends on what happens in court, what evidence is allowed, how it is interpreted, and whether it is enough to meet the legal standard required for conviction. And until that happens, there are only possibilities, not answers. Only two potential directions this case can go, and both of them lead somewhere permanent, but the decision has not been made yet. People tend to form conclusions quickly, but the legal system doesn't follow that rhythm. It slows everything down on purpose, not to delay truth, but to protect it. Because rushing a conclusion in a criminal case can lead to irreversible consequences. So far, only one part of the process is complete: the formal charging stage. That means the state believes there is enough evidence to bring the case before a court, but that is not the same as proving it. Not legally, not yet. Everything after that point is still open. What evidence will be allowed? What testimony will be challenged? What interpretations will be accepted by a jury? And those decisions will shape everything that follows. For people directly involved in the case, the legal teams, investigators, and the court system, this waiting period is procedural, structured, expected. But for everyone watching from the outside, it feels unresolved because there is no closure yet, no final explanation, only a build-up toward one. And that's what makes this stage so unusual. It's not the beginning anymore, but it's not the end either. It exists somewhere in between. And that space in between is where most of the story currently sits. Because until a jury hears the full case, until evidence is tested under oath, and until both sides present everything they have, there is no final version of events, only competing ones. And whichever one survives that process will become the official story. But until that moment arrives, this case remains exactly what it has been since the beginning: unfinished, unanswered, and still unfolding.